Today, Julian Dendy from the Coral Reef Research Foundation will be presenting his research on the vegetation change from 1921 to 2014 on Babeldaob Island, Palau, a research sensing summary synthesis. This project is the result of a collaboration of the Institute of Pacific Island Forestry, the Coral Reef Research Foundation, and Palau Forestry. So, Julian, whenever you're ready, you can start. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Julian. I got my master's degree from Hilo in the Tropical Conservation Biology and Environmental Science program. So shout out to all those people over there. This project came about from my graduate work where I was studying forest restoration in the Lake Ngardak Nature Reserve, which is on Babeldaob. And one of the aspects of that project was looking at vegetation change over time within the reserve. And so two of my advisors who work at the Institute of Pacific Island Forestry, Susan Cordell and Christian Giardina, thought it would be a good idea to look at vegetation change using those data sets for the whole island. So that's pretty much how this came about. So it's one of those classic never-ending projects. This is actually the 10th year since we started, right after I graduated in 2011. But we just submitted our manuscript, so looks like we're finally done or close to it. Anyway, so this is all about that. The Republic of Palau is part of the Micronesian region, which is a huge area of mostly ocean in the northwestern tropical Pacific Ocean. Palau is in the western part of Micronesia. As you can see from this map, it's pretty close to the Philippines and Indonesia. And on the right side of the screen, you can see the archipelago of Palau. Those are the main islands, which includes a barrier reef, a big lagoon, and you can see Babeldaob is the largest island within the lagoon. Palau is a wonderful place. It's got very diverse marine and terrestrial habitats. It's mostly known for the iconic rock islands and jellyfish and other marine lakes in the state of Koror in the southern part of the lagoon. But its forests are relatively underappreciated and quite diverse. As I mentioned, it's an island archipelago with many hundreds of islands, most of which are limestone and uninhabited. All of the volcanic islands are inhabited, and Babeldaob is volcanic. It's tropical with high rainfall, and Babeldaob at least is quite ancient, around 40 million years old. It's, as I mentioned, it's the largest island in Palau and the second largest island in Micronesia, approaching 400 square kilometers. And humans have been there for at least 3,000 years. They brought fire, developed complex villages, and made massive changes to the landscape. And pollen records indicate that the forest and non-forest cover, what we're calling savanna, have fluctuated multiple times over the centuries. So just a brief rundown of the recent history of Palau. I gathered this information from the internet, so don't quote me on any of this. But it was known as an overseas territory of the Spanish East Indies, known as Palaus, administered by the Viceroyalty of New Spain from Mexico City from the late 1500s to 1899. And this period was mostly Catholic missionary activity, but I think a large part of that time period, maybe most Palauans had no idea that they were part of the Spanish East Indies. After the Spanish-American War, Spain sold its small islands to Germany in the Spanish-German Treaty. From 1899 to 1914, it was one of Imperial German Pacific protectorates within German New Guinea. And during that time, they developed coconut plantations. And on the island of Angkor, which is on the southernmost part of the main island group, they were mining phosphate. From 1914 to 1945, it became part of Japan's South Seas Mandate by the League of Nations after the end of World War I, although Japan had already seized it from Germany by that time. And during that time period, Japanese laborers attempted to create an export-based economy of agriculture and mining. It was bauxite mining and mostly vegetable agriculture, mostly being exported to mainland Japan, I believe. During that time period, it was the site of major battles and many skirmishes in World War II, and was taken by U.S. forces from Japan in 1944. It was made a trust territory of the U.S. in 1947, and it was a trustee until 1994, although its constitution was approved in 1981, and they signed a compact of free association with the United States in 1982. So from 1994 until the present day, it's been an independent nation. So these are the remote sensing resources or imagery of the island that we were aware of when we started the project. From 1921, when the Japanese first started administering the country, they created a hand-drawn black and white topographic map. After the end of the war, the U.S. Army created a black and white, they created a hand-drawn topographic map from black and white aerial photos. In 1976, the U.S. Forest Service created a hand-drawn vegetation map from black and white aerial photos. In 1992, the Nature Conservancy conducted a rapid resource assessment, which included documentation of the islands with aerial color photos. And then there's some publicly available Landsat satellite imagery. It's available online. And in 2006, a Quickbird satellite image composite was made public. And in 2014, a WorldView 2 satellite image composite was made public. So these were the resources that we were hoping to compile. So our goals for the study were to organize, classify, and summarize vegetation cover of Babeldaob using publicly available remote sensing datasets, and determine if the variable vegetation cover information could be used to compare cover change over time if we use broad enough categories. And the categories we chose were forest, non-forest vegetation, which mostly means savanna, mangrove, and non-vegetation. And we wanted to find out what could this vegetation cover change history tell us about the effects of historical events on forest cover. So this was kind of a late addition to our project because it was unavailable to us in the beginning, but the Japanese remote sensing data set was being stored at the library of the University of Tokyo, and there was a PhD student about 10 years ago who was working with the Palau National Museum, studying land use change with a focus on traditional agricultural systems and the impact of industrial agriculture and mining on forest recovery. So she was the one who put together this map from 1921, and there was a focus on agroforest. So in order to make the temporal comparison, we changed agroforest to forest and grassland to non-forest vegetation for that comparison. So this is what that map looked like after those vegetation classes were put into the broader categories. You can see it's mostly forest at that time. This was before they started most of their industrial activities on the island. After the war, the U.S. Army took a bunch of aerial photos of the islands, And on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that's what they look like. As part of this project, we organized and compiled all of the historical imagery that was available at the library at UH Manoa. So we have all of those stored and organized if anyone's interested in using those. The idea was originally to make all of our own maps, but these images didn't have the fiducial marks, which are required for georeferencing and so forth. So since the Army had already produced a topographic map from the images, we decided to just use the map. But in order to do the temporal comparison, we had to change coconut plantation to forest. And there was a scrub vegetation category, which we changed to non-forest vegetation. And they had a marsh category, which did not correspond to present-day marsh, but present-day mangrove. So we added that to the mangrove category. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that's what the original topographic map from the US Army looked like. And this is what the vegetation cover map looks like when you compile all the general vegetation classes. You can see, I don't know if you remember the 1921 map, but there's some substantial areas of non-forest vegetation in the middle of the island now. Then in the mid-70s, the US Forest Service produced a vegetation, quite detailed vegetation map of the island. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see an example of what those images look like. And you can see they have those little X marks in the corners, which you use to orthorectify and georeference the images. On the right-hand side, you can see the map of all the original vegetation classes, which US Forest Service came up with, which is a really good map and still being used today. And it was digitized by the Palau Automated Land and Resource Imaging System, which is Palau's GIS program, basically. And so to do the temporal comparison with that, we changed secondary vegetation to forest. And that was classified as mostly like bamboo and other fast-growing secondary trees, but it's more forest than non-forest vegetation to us. And we changed barren, urban, and water to non-vegetation for temporal comparison. So then that's what that vegetation cover map looks like. As you can see, the forest has recovered quite a bit, but there's also some areas of non-vegetation where there weren't before. We were able to borrow the collection of color aerial photos from the Nature Conservancy office in Palau. And it was probably good timing because they were starting to age, and I don't know how much longer they would have been usable in that format where they're just being stored in boxes in their office. But anyway, we digitized, orthorectified, georeferenced, mosaicked, and classified all of those general vegetation classes. As you can see in the middle of the island, there's that white spot, which is where the pilot didn't overlap the images quite enough. But thankfully, that's mostly forest in the interior area, so we were able to use some other images to correct that. And that's what the general vegetation cover map for that period looks like. You can see the road layers shows up quite a bit more clearly in this one. And then for including the satellite images in our classification, we had to collect ground truth points in order to inform the computers that were performing classifications. So in order to do that, we used a road layer from Polaris and the 1976 vegetation map. And so we generated a bunch of random points within 200 meters of roads across the island and collected all of the main vegetation categories as well as marsh and swamp forest in order to determine how precise the classifications could be. And due to some points changing and some errors in the original map, we had to go back several times and generate more points. But at the end of the day, we had more than at least 50 points for each class. And I think for forest, there were well over 100 points. So we used a handheld GPS to navigate to those. And we only included areas with at least 15 square meters of cover. Because the Landsat resolution is 15 meters, at least the Landsat that we were using. And we also collected observations of vegetation cover and any change that was likely or that had obviously occurred since 1976. So we did all this work in 2012. And you can see on the map by the colors, the different colors of the dots, the different vegetation cover classes. So they're spread fairly uniformly across the island, although given that there's no roads and a lot of the island, there's some pretty big chunks which were not ground truth at all. But overall, it was a very accurate map at over 85%. So we used these to inform the classifications of the different satellite images that we had access to. And so for the Landsat, we downloaded almost all of the mostly cloud-free images from the internet from 1999 to 2001. We mosaicked them and created a model to remove most of the clouds and shadows. It's kind of an issue in the tropics in general with remote sensing. It's often rainy or cloudy, and so you have to figure out what to do about the cloud and shadow cover oftentimes. But unfortunately, even with the model we still had some cloud cover, so I think it's about 1.5% that's showing up in the image here. And then for the Quickbird Satellite classification, this was, I believe this was collected as part of an environmental assessment for a perimeter road project, which started in that time period. And so the image that we had is a mosaic, which includes pieces from 2003 to 2006. And we used the same ground truth points as with the Landsat classification. We had to use a digital elevation model to improve the mangrove classification because it was picking up some mangrove deep inside the interior of the island, which is incorrect. But we think it was probably picking up areas with high moisture content like marsh and swamp forest. So the DEM model improved that. Due to the high resolution, this imagery, unlike the Landsat, which was 15 meters, this was, I think, just over a 0.5 meter resolution. And so when you start to use imagery of this resolution, it starts to pick up a bunch of shadows from tree canopy and so forth. And so that was an issue with this. It was highly speckled with non-vegetation, which was shadows from trees. So we created a bunch of polygons within forest and mangrove where we were pretty sure it was nearly total cover of those two classes. And we calculated the mean shadow area in those kinds of forest, and we used that to adjust the cover values for this image. And for the World View 2 image, I believe this one was provided in order to show the impact of a super typhoon. There were actually 2 super typhoons which passed through Palau, I think in late 2012 and 2013. So the idea was to have some sort of documentation of the aftermath of that. So this was another publicly available imagery source. But this one had highly variable spectral characteristics, which made the classification quite difficult and took a long time. We also used the digital elevation model to improve the mangrove, as well as it's a sort of a GIS remote sensing tool called a kernel to pick out areas of, if it's just like a pixel or a couple pixels that seem to be in the wrong area, you can use that to sort of smooth it out and improve it. So we use those to improve the mangrove and non-forest vegetation classes. But it was still underestimating the mangrove cover. And we think the reason for that was that it was picking up different species of trees in the mangroves, and maybe some of those trees were closer to trees in the normal forest than in the mangrove. And so it was calling some of those areas regular forest within the mangrove. And so that was still the case with the final classification, unfortunately. So looking at the trends over time, obviously the largest changes occurred during the Japanese colonial occupation of the island, which had both the largest forest loss and the biggest total change of vegetation cover. By far the greatest forest growth or forest recovery, if you will, occurred in the 30 years after the end of World War II. After that, from the mid-70s to the early 90s, forest growth pretty much plateaued, and there was actually a tiny negative net forest change. We're not sure why that is, but it could be people moving back from the capital of Koror to the island to build houses, and I think many of them had moved after the end of the war because of economic opportunities in Koror, but maybe by that time some people were moving back, but we don't know for sure. And there continued to be net forest increases from the early 90s until our last image in the series in 2014, which was kind of surprising, and I'll mention a bit more about that in a second. So here we have sort of a general look at forest trends from 1947 to 2006. And we're using that time frame because that's when we have polygon shapefiles of all of these veg classes, which are easy to compare directly, whereas the satellite classifications are a little bit trickier. And so from that, the Japanese researcher, Dr. Iida, shared her 1921 polygon file as well as 2006 file, which she had manually digitized. And so we were able to make some long-term, nice-looking maps with the help of some of her data sets. And so on the map, you can see on the outside of the island is mangrove, that dark brown color. And the green is areas where forest was cleared in the Japanese period from 1921 to 1947, but then grew back between 1947 and 2006. Those other areas of the little bit lighter brown are areas that were cleared that had not grown back by 2006. And that beige or tan sand color were areas that were savanna or non-forest vegetation in 1921. So that was before the Japanese started their activities. And then that pink color above that are areas that changed to forest cover between 1921 and 2006 in those original areas of savanna cover on the island. And so most of the forest growth occurred in areas that were cleared between 1921 and 1947, almost 80%. And the rest occurred in areas that were non-forest vegetation in 1921. About a third of non-forest vegetation cover in 1921 had changed to forest by 2006. Whereas about 2/3 of forest area cleared between 1921 and 1946 had changed to forest by 2006. So there's something about these areas which have been savanna for a long time, which is perhaps limiting their vegetation change. Throughout the study period, mangroves maintained their cover pretty much. And so most differences that we report between time periods is mostly due to methodological variation or differences in coastlines, and sometimes an indistinct boundary between swamp forest and mangrove, because swamp forest often occurs on the inland edge of mangroves. We did notice some changes in mangroves in the imagery. For example, there's some places where you can see like small islands of mangrove that merge into larger islands or merge into the coastline itself over time. And also areas where the mangrove was perhaps disappearing, and certainly areas of like traditional mangrove channels, which people would use to take boats through and go fishing and so forth. Many of those areas were starting to fill in as road transport options became more available. But based on our methodology, we couldn't quantify those, unfortunately. Based on our ground truth point observations, about a quarter of the points that we visited had changed cover between 1976 and 2012. And of those points, about 70% were non-vegetation, of which 62% had changed to non-forest vegetation, and 38% had changed to forest. In this picture here, you can see two Palau foresters, Dino Masubid and Bungalang Tabalak, who were crucial in helping me find these points. They work for Palau Forestry, who was a partner in this project. But you can see they're standing on an old railway line, which the Japanese were using to transport bauxite mining material from some of the interior areas to the coast. And I'm pretty sure that was a non-vegetation area in 1976, but by 2012, it was already forest. You can see the tree growing out of the train tracks right there. That's a Campnosperma tree, which is relatively iconic for the Micronesian region and grows relatively fast. Bare areas, which is sort of a subcategory of non-vegetation, were likely underestimated across the study period because they're usually relatively small compared to other vegetation cover types. Roads and houses were problematic in all classifications, and cover was underestimated in Landsat due to the low resolution, because most of the roads and houses are smaller in width or length, usually width, than the resolution. And they were also underestimated in the Quickbird and Worldview 2 classifications due to spectral variation and overhanging canopy. So in a lot of places, there's trees growing over the road surface areas. However, the non-vegetation cover class increased by at least 3 times over the study period. It wasn't estimated at all in the 1921 and 1947 time periods, but by 2006, there's about 3% of total non-vegetation cover of the island. So that was the biggest increase of all the classes, and about half of which was due to road construction, a lot of which was due to what they call the compact road, which was a perimeter road that was built all around the island and was financed by what they call a compact of free association between Palau and the United States. And so at the time I was living there, at the time when it was constructed, a lot of people were very concerned about what the effects of the road would be over time. And as it turns out, well, we used a buffer 400 feet on each side of the road to pick out vegetation change nearby the road. And so as it turns out, there was more growth nearby roads than there was overall on the island. So between 2006 and 2014, there was 10 to 18% growth nearby all roads, 15 to 22% nearby the compact road, and 4 to 5% overall across the island. And so that range is using our classification, which is at the high end, and US Forest Service map, which was produced last year, which used a polygon-based classification. And so, as I mentioned earlier, maybe a little bit, these high-resolution images and classifications overestimate the forest oftentimes by picking out small patches of forest and individual trees and shrubs. And so a lot of what we're seeing here is a result of that high resolution. But from personal observation, going back to the island periodically, you can definitely see vegetation recovery near the road. So that was an interesting and unexpected outcome. So in conclusion, the forest on Babeldaob is resilient and has recovered substantially since the end of World War II. But more recent growth appears to be secondary forest trees and shrubs along a dynamic forest edge, which is subject to wildfire and other land use disturbances. Babeldaob Island is very old and its soils erode easily, and highly degraded areas on Babeldaob are very slow to develop vegetation cover. While some of these degraded areas are due to Japanese agricultural and mining efforts, many are older, perhaps considerably more ancient. And finally, broadly summarized results from diverse remote sensing sources offer valuable temporal trends of vegetation cover change. I think I went a bit quick. I don't know if anyone has any questions.
Thank you for that. That was awesome. No, it was awesome. Roger has his, I guess, your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. I'm wondering what the impact of these changes have been on the bird life of the island. I mean, there's some species which are endemic to the island, and I really wonder what the impact of all that has had on them.
I think it's unknown for the most part. People have been studying the birds periodically. They have a national bird surveys which have taken place. Well, I think there have been two, one in the mid-90s and one maybe 10 years later. And so it seems like the bird life in general is relatively stable, although some of the species which people like to hunt and eat have been showing a downward trend, in addition to the Palau flying fox, which people also eat. And so that's it is a bit concerning because those species that people like to eat are the principal seed dispersers. So it could be that the seeds that they're generally moving around, or those species are perhaps becoming less common over time, and some of the smaller, or at least the species with smaller seeds, which some of the other bird species tend to disperse, maybe those are becoming more common. I don't know, it's just a guess, but it's not really known.
Okay, thank you.
Good question.
We have another question from Phil asking, was the regrown vegetation native plants, or were they, was there some invasive plants in the mix?
It's mostly native. I think Palau is in a really good situation compared to a lot of other areas in the Pacific, in that it's mostly native and endemic forest cover. And so most of the regrowth was also native. They have a lot of generalist species, and For whatever reason, invasives tend to not take hold very easily there. I don't know if it's because the natives are good competitors or because the soil is so poor, or maybe a combination of both or other things. There are some like remnant species that were left over from the Japanese farming efforts, which you can come across from time to time when you're wandering around the forest. So they have like little patches of like rattan and mangosteen and other trees and fruit species which the Japanese were experimenting with. But for the most part, over time, the natives generally take over. I think Micronesia is there.
Wow. Oh, go ahead, Roger.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the land ownership and management, whether the forests are nationally owned or whether they're commercially owned, and whether that has an impact on the long-term future.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. I was going to mention some of the potential reasons why the aftermath of the road development hasn't been as detrimental to the forests as is often the case in tropical areas around the world. We think it's probably a combination of different ecological and socioeconomic factors. So the land is all Palauan owned, and they have control over all of their land and natural resources. So that's a big piece of the equation. There are non-Palauans who are living there, but it's very difficult to get land ownership or land tenure if you're not Palauan. If you're not a Palauan citizen, then I think the maximum you can get is a 99-year lease. And mostly that's like companies and corporations who are interested in long-term development plans, which often don't work out very well. But at the local level, most of the forest area belongs to the states. I think I forgot to mention in the introduction, but Palau is divided into, I think, 16 states, and Babeldaob has 10. And so they kind of correspond to ancient like village complexes for the most part. And so the states are in control of the most of the forest resources within the state boundaries. And they also have a protected area network, which includes marine and terrestrial protected areas. And so a fair proportion of the island is covered with protected areas. And so generally those are in a little bit better condition than areas outside of those. And otherwise, most of the rest of the land is privately owned. And it seems like there's a relatively straightforward and well-respected land ownership. I think one of the main issues is hunters going out looking for birds and flying foxes who often burn the non-forest vegetation to facilitate their access to forest areas. And so sometimes those guys will enter into protected areas or other state-owned areas and start wildfires and remove natural resources. But for the most part, I think the forests are and land ownership is pretty well respected.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Does anyone else have any other questions? And if not, I can let us go early. Yeah, so thank you so much, everybody, and especially to Julian for sharing all this wonderful information about Palau. And yeah, and everybody have a great Thanksgiving weekend. Thank you all for coming.